So you're asking about the diplomatic timetable. So U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was in Israel early this week, part of a series of very senior U.S. visitors coming to consult with Israel and to be part of the War Cabinet's deliberations. And in the press conference, he said public that he's not here to set any timelines or any guidance. That was interpreted by some in Israel to say that when you say that deliberately in public, it does mean that he was very much in private setting timelines. And therefore, it's thought the best case scenario that the end of January, the US have given that they want to see this wrapped up. Others think that the timeline is even shorter than that. I think part of it hasn't been determined. Part of it depends on facts on the ground, on events. Israel has to act very carefully and judiciously when all of their targeting, especially from the air campaign, to make sure that there are no excessive and unnecessary deaths from non-combatants, because that will shorten the time period in which the leeway that Israel has to act. But I think broadly speaking, both from the US and the UK and other significant allies, there's an understanding that Israel must be allowed to win, that there cannot be a situation where Hamas are allowed to survive the next day, not only for Israel, but for the broader kind of alliance that we have evolving, and that we were talking about earlier this year, of the moderate Palestinian Arab states across the region. Certainly the Gulf, certainly Saudi Arabia, hopefully certain aspects of the Palestinian West Bank society as well, all have a vested interest in seeing Hamas defeated and significantly defeated, so that they cannot pose a threat again. By the way, as we stand here, these are nice words, but it's far from a done deal or clear that Israel will reach those objectives. So we have to be vigilant, and it will be very bad for Israel and for the region if this war ends and Hamas is still in power. If Sinwar is able to appear the next day and rear his head, and then just the fact of his survival, he'll be able to declare a victory of sorts. And so that's very dangerous for Israel. It's very dangerous for Israel's deterrence, and it's very dangerous for broader patterns of peace in the region.
Thanks, Richard. What's the risk that this current war in Gaza ends, but then we move on pretty quickly afterwards to a second and potentially more dangerous war with Hezbollah in Lebanon?
Well, listen, since the 8th of October, had we not been fighting in the south, we would be in a state of warfare already with Hezbollah, in terms that they are daily dozens of rockets, dozens of incidents every day along the northern border. Most of them are restricted to very close parameters within the border, although there have been instances of it stretching further deep, 5 or even 10 kilometers. If I give a quick plug to a Bicom product, if people are interested, tomorrow Bicom is releasing a new podcast where I interviewed an expert on Hezbollah, Lieutenant Colonel Sarit Zahavi, and she gave them some fascinating insight into the issue. So I will be releasing that tomorrow on Bicom platforms. But essentially, what she was saying and what others are saying is that we should be very worried that the threat and capacity of Hezbollah is significantly larger and greater capacity than Hamas, both in terms of the sophistication of rockets, precision guided missiles, the payload, the accuracy, and the quantity. Similar to Gaza, they are also embedded within a civilian population, and hopefully the lessons are being learned of the destruction that is brought onto Gaza faces southern Lebanon, God forbid, if we were to find ourselves in that predicament. A lot of us here were thinking in terms of the coordination between Hamas and Hezbollah, that had Hezbollah known in real time the success that Hamas were having on the 7th of October, then they should have joined in at the same time and brought incredible destruction to the north of Israel as well, and really made horrific inroads into incapacitating the IDF. When I spoke to my friend Sarit earlier, the Lieutenant Colonel from intelligence, she had a different theory that basically said that the way that it's panning out is exactly according to the Hamas, the Hezbollah and the Iranian playbook. And by that, she meant that it actually suits them to drag Israel into a much longer conflict, for them to be occupied with Hamas, but still have to deal with a low-level threat on the border without it escalating into war. For Hezbollah, at any point that they decide to step it up and to further stretch and exasperate Israel further down. And alluding, Luke, to your earlier question about the kind of the economic threats, this will soon become a factor. With 300,000 Israelis called up into reservists, there's only a finite amount of time that the Israeli economy can absorb such a cost to its system without kind of having significant economic breakdown. So the depressing, sad news is that we are caught in this situation of Hezbollah, that without an operation, the people are going to be unprepared. 80,000 people in the north who have been evacuated and left their homes are going to be unprepared to move back, that it won't be safe. And if there is a conflict and an escalation, then that's probably going to put even more Israelis at risk and lead to further destruction of the home front. So we're really facing a very, very difficult situation there.
Okay, I think where we had got to was I was just about to ask you a question about the Houthis. Does that ring a bell? So, which
Sure.
was, are they just a sideshow or are they a real threat? I mean, the amount, the quantity of naval firepower that has been sent there by various international navies off the coast of Yemen suggests that the international community is taking them very seriously indeed.
So my first comment would be that this kind of the element or the dimension of the Houthis in this war just proves kind of how complicated this is for Israeli policymakers. I was listing there are around a dozen separate dimensions to this current war, and if I can name them all, or kind of run through a list of issues that Israel has to factor in. You've got Israel against Hamas. You've got Israel against Hezbollah. You've got Israel against Syrian proxies. You've got the Houthi threat, both in terms of the missiles and the UAVs. You've got the Houthi threat in terms of the shipping lanes and international maritime. You've got the threat in the West Bank. You've got the issue of the divide between Hamas and Fatah within the Palestinian society. You've got the Iraqi proxies attacking American forces, which also started on October the 8th. You've got the Iranian angle of the conventional military threat. You've got the Iranian angle on the nuclear threat. You've got the Qatari role in all this. And to add a final version, which I just picked up last night, that there is also an issue now of increased smuggling and weapons running from the Syrian border into Jordan. And the Jordanian army are fighting against these Iranian proxies that are trying to bring in mass weapons. That used to be the smuggling route of the Carpagen drugs that are kind of spreading through the region. But now they're also trying to spread weapons in order to feed that into the West Bank. So that's just another element of this of this conflict. You also have the roles of the moderate or the pragmatic Arab states and what they're doing, the UAE and Jordan, trying to alleviate the suffering in Gaza in coordination with Israel as well, the Egyptian role. So all of this has to be factored into and the Houthis are just a part of this. The fact that they are shooting sophisticated ballistic missiles with a range of over 2,000 kilometers targeting Israel south is a new phenomena. At the beginning of the war, the first ever interception, that who'd have thought the first actual practical space war anywhere on the planet would be fired from Yemen, and Israel would have to defend itself against such sophisticated rockets. So this is almost unprecedented. By the way, some of these rockets have been hit out, have been intercepted by the U.S. Navy. Some of them have been intercepted by Israel, and some of them have also been intercepted by the Saudis. Again, behind the scenes, another element of kind of working within that unofficial camp of the moderates or pragmatists. In terms of the second element of the Houthi threat, which I think is actually more significant, is that what's happening in the shipping lanes, and people would have seen the videos of the raids on these ships. It's something out of a Hollywood film set. But we can only, Israel has been preaching for the last couple of weeks to emphasize that this is an international issue, an issue for the international order. And thankfully, the US also recognizes that and has therefore put together this coalition, this NATO-led multinational coalition, which we saw yesterday, kind of the show of force along the seas, which hopefully is enough to deter and to protect the shipping lanes and to put the Houthis back in their place. But again, all of this combines as well the overarching agenda of Iran pulling the strings, both on Hamas, both on Hezbollah, both in Iraq, both in Syria, and also from Yemen.
Thanks, Richard. And then final question from me, turning to the political situation inside Israel. How is the mood developing in terms of the Israeli public on the home front, and has Netanyahu used up all of his political 9 lives?
Well, first of all, with Netanyahu, he has many various monikers and nicknames, but as the magician, never rule him out. I mean, it's a little bit cynical, but I think it's reasonable to suggest that Netanyahu is already in campaign mode, that a lot of his decision making, even with, and this is not necessarily a compliment, because one should be focused solely on the war objectives, which I believe he is, but as a very shrewd politician, he's also at the same time playing in campaigning role. What I mean by that is that there are 2 hard and fast rules that Netanyahu sticks to throughout his political career. One is never neglect your base, and that kind of in Netanyahu has proved to success over the last decade and a half, essentially amongst the right wing, the hard right, and the ultra orthodox. That explains why in the wartime budget that was just passed, he insisted on allowing the funds to go to those coalition partners, because he understood that you buy their patronage and their loyalty by dishing out those funds. So even though sectoral fundraising should never be as part of a wartime budget, he acquiesced and allowed his finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, to do his bidding for him to ensure there was peace and quiet and calm within his coalition. The second issue is his principle is never take your hands off the wheel, which essentially is you never give an inch. And this is why, unlike all the other leaders who took responsibility straight away, both on a political level and on a military level, Netanyahu can't say those words, "I am responsible." He refuses to do that and is much happier blaming other people. Now, whether ultimately he was to blame or not, we can go on and discuss that. But the fact that kind of as an essence of leadership, he doesn't want to be tarnished by that phrase and admit it. A lot of the Israelis now have moved on. They don't expect any more from him. They don't expect it. How much this is going to hurt him or help him, we're still a long way away. As I said before, there are too many presumptions being made about the day after, presuming that Israel will be victorious. And will he then be able to get a dividend from the successful prosecution of the war? God forbid for all of us, if Israel is not successful, the least of our problems will be Netanyahu's domestic political problems, of which they will be many. I think a scenario similar to after Yom Kippur War, that only months later, after all the reservists were released from the army, did you only then see a massive uprising and protests against the government and against their failure. And I think that's quite a likely scenario. But as I said, the war, which is still in phase 2 out of 4 phases, still has a long way to run. And so that politics will wait until the day after.
Thanks. So I'm now going to start taking some questions from the chat. 1 or 2 of the earlier ones have actually been overtaken by answers you've already given. So I hope people will appreciate that they've kind of, in broad terms, had their questions answered, because Richard got to that on my ones. The first one I can see is there a question in terms of the timelines about US supply of ammunition, and is there a risk that at a certain stage the Americans stop or run down resupply and that ends?
Yeah. Listen, people were very concerned about that recently. It seems to be that last week, I mentioned that every week there's a different senior US official coming in. Last week, when National Security Advisor Sullivan came in, the understanding is that he reassured Israel that despite the diplomatic and political elements to this, that the resupply of munitions would continue. Now, again, that's been kind of guaranteed. This is not confirmed by any public proclamations. This is kind of the understanding from what was reached inside the room, that they will not hold that threat over Israel, that they will continue that resupply. So we can only hope that is true. But again, it's only true until it's not true. And so that is quite a precarious situation. I think there's also a distinction between understanding the US that they want to see an end to this phase, and this phase is referred to kind of the intensive stage of a heavy presence of hundreds, if not thousands, tens of thousands of troops on the ground deep inside Palestinian Gazan territory. And that stage, as we said at the beginning, is likely to run some point through in January, depending on the conduct, dependent on a variety of factors. And after that, it will move to a more standoffish position. The idea that Israel will create a buffer zone at some point, a kilometre or so, perhaps deep into Gaza, and that will then allow the rehabilitation, hopefully, of the Israeli communities on the other side of the border. So the bottom line is that the US, let's be fair to the US. I think they've done. Joe Biden is referred to here as Grandpa Joe, Saba Joe in Hebrew, in terms of that he could be the most Zionist president that has ever been. Because when it really mattered, he moved the aircraft carriers the first day of the war. He moved a second aircraft carrier in. He made an incredibly passionate speech. He came and visited himself within the first week. The air train, they refer to it, about this kind of resupply, replenishment of munitions, started after 3 days. Heroically, in the 73, it took 8 days for the air train to set up. Here it took 3 days. So there is a lot, and the continuing backing of Israel in diplomatic forums, particularly in the UN Security Council. There is a lot that the US has done, and I think a lot that Israel should be and is grateful for. The question is, that we're entering into an election period there as well. There are other factors within the Democratic Party. There are other factors that the US needs to take into consideration as well. And we hope that the line holds and they stay as loyal and supportive as they have been.
Thanks. Next question. Ben-Gvir wants the war cabinet disbanded and the war conducted by the full cabinet, which would obviously include him and other people off to the right of the political spectrum. Is that likely to happen?
A short answer, no. It's true that this is unprecedented, that you have a minister with a security portfolio, i.e. the internal security, or now it's been called national security minister, who has been totally isolated from security making bodies. By the way, this was the same even before October the 7th. He was already being carved out of the decisions, and the Prime Minister's office often made a point of kind of listing the people who attended the meetings, and certainly made it clear by inference that the Ben-Gvir was not invited and not included. There were other examples I remember over the summer. For example, when he wanted to change the criteria of the treatment of Palestinian security prisoners, and that's actually in his remit. The prisons authority, just like the police, by law comes under his authority. But the commissioner of the prisons understood politically what Ben-Gvir was trying to do, understood how damaging it would be, and so she went above his head and called for a Security Council meeting. Security Cabinet. At the Security Cabinet meeting, you have the Minister of Defence, the head of the Army, the head of military intelligence, the head of the National Security Council, all of them backing the police commissioner and the prison commissioner against Minister Ben-Gvir. Again, we know that Ben-Gvir not only is he a radical, he was too radical even to serve in the army. He is totally out of his depth and inexperience. So it made sense for him to keep up his bombastic statements, to keep making provocations, and to insist that he is part of the decision-making forum. But I don't think that's going to happen.
Okay. Next question. You made a passing reference when you were saying about all the different theatres or areas of security issues for Israel. You mentioned the West Bank. Can you tell us more about the security situation in the West Bank? Is there a danger it could deteriorate to such an extent that Israel is effectively fighting on a third front, and that reduces its ability to defeat Hamas and contain Hezbollah?
So that's definitely a fear. I think it's a real fear. It's an ongoing fear. The fact that it hasn't happened until now is obviously a great relief for all of us and for all Israelis. I know, speaking to people in the West Bank, it's very tense there right now. There are at least kind of three competing trends, let's say, within the West Bank. The first of all is that Hamas still has a presence in the West Bank, especially in places like Tulkarem and Jenin and Nablus. And the IDF has been operating there in parallel to all the other fronts, has been operating against what they consider the ticking bombs, i.e. people that are actually planning terror attacks, and have gone in quite forcefully. They've arrested over 2,000 people in the last 2 months. Over 1,000 of them are affiliated with Hamas. There have been several deaths. I don't know the exact numbers, but I think in the range of a couple of hundred people. The majority of them are armed combatants. And so Israel is fighting a counter-terrorism on that level. Thankfully, as well, that there have not been mass protests in the Palestinian areas. And so despite the problematic relationship that Israel has with the PA security forces until now are still holding the line as well and making sure to stop that friction between the IDF and the Palestinian population. There have been isolated examples of Palestinian Authority troops or their relatives being involved in terrorism as well, and that's also a trend that we need to look out for, because if the worst case scenario in the West Bank is that it's actually the Palestinian Authority, like what happened in the Second Intifada, that make the strategic decision to turn their weapons against Israel, either whether it be civilians or the army, and that takes us into a very, very difficult situation. So we're not there yet, but we have to be very wary of that. And compounding those issues are the overexuberance of a minority of Jewish settlers, of especially kind of the hardline Jewish settlers who feel they have the tailwind and backing from our friend Ben Gvir that we just discussed, who are attacking Palestinian communities, who are preventing them from the harvest of the olive fields close to settlements, and are genuinely have a vested interest to provoke and to incite. And, not in, as an Israeli, I say, not in my name. And this is kind of also a real risk. So far, it has been limited and contained, but any elements of it, and I think we need to call it out as well of what it is, that this is in some respects Jewish terrorism. And it pains me to even say that phrase, because it's a new phenomenon that we shouldn't be dealing with. But we have to be recognized this is a minority of the settlement population, but it does exist.
Thanks. Next question. There are allegations that Israel is seeking to do deals with Arab states to effectively ethnically cleanse Gaza of Palestinian Arabs, to kind of move people into Egypt or something. Is there any truth in that allegation at all? Where's it come from? Like, what's the basis on which?
Okay, so in terms of government policy, that it's not true. It's nowhere. It's not being discussed in the Security Cabinet. It's not a real issue. Primarily because, first of all, Israel understands the toxicity of the idea of transfer. That's kind of, it's illegal within the Israeli political discourse even to advocate for transfer. Second of all, because of the high regard Israel has for the security relationship with Egypt, and Egypt has incredible sensitivity over this. However, having said that, it is true that there are some Israeli politicians who are speaking about this idea. So there's no smoke without fire. There are people, Danny Danon, for example, even the more liberal Ram Ben Barak, who's rivaling, again, in a pre-October 7th world, we were talking about him rivaling Yair Lapid for the leadership of Yesh Atid. He also came out in a joint statement with Danny Danon to such an extent. You can have a benign reading of it that says, if 70% of the buildings in northern Gaza have been destroyed and are therefore inhabitable, then it's actually more humane, just like other places and solutions around the world led to refugees and populations moving out. So the Arab world should, by necessity, kind of offer supportive hand to the Palestinians and offer them resettlement if it helps their lives. I think that misses the point that we should be cognizant to recognise that within the Palestinian narrative and discourse, going back to 48 and the trauma from their perspective of the removal of them from their villages. Again, this was a war that they started, just like a war that they've started this time round. Nevertheless, there is heightened sensitivity for the idea of removing anyone from the overall territory in which they have lived. And so the Israeli official government policy is not talking about that at all, and is looking basically at the moment in the short term to keep them in the Al-Mawasi area, which is a 14-kilometer strip to the, I can show you back on the map again, but in the bottom left-hand corner of the Gaza Strip by the coastal plain, close to the Egyptian border. That's the safe zone. By the way, even that safe zone has seen in the last 2 or 3 weeks rockets being fired from the safe zone, again, which further compounds the concept of a safe zone. But that's where they're encouraging the civilian population to go. And then at some point, when the end of this phase 2 and the intense fighting, the ground incursion stops, then there will be an effort to move people back to their homes where possible, and then to find a mechanism within the international community to rehabilitate those areas. So transfer is most certainly not on the agenda in any real policy terms.
Okay. Next question from the chat. What's the mood music from Iran? What are they up to?
What are they up to? Well, listen, this is a huge challenge. I've been talking to some military experts, kind of raising the concern, not just me, lots of people, that whilst the world was focused on Ukraine and Russia before this, and now even more so on Gaza and on Hezbollah, what are Iran doing in terms of the incremental advancements towards the nuclear threshold? That's a real threat that we have to rely on the IAEA when they next report back to understand how they assess the latest level of enrichment. But I certainly think that is part of the game. And by the way, that same theory that I mentioned earlier about the Iranian agenda to keep this as a prolonged campaign, a kind of a war of attrition, if you like, and to wear Israel down by attacking on various fronts. This is part of an overall Iranian strategy that they understand Israel has enormous military strength, but over time you can wear them down and you can attack them from multiple fronts. And again, the economic costs kick in. So this is all part of, I think, unfortunately, part of an Iranian strategy. And this requires much more of support for Israel from the international community. I mentioned before, full of praise for the US, but I think still more needs to be done by the UK, by Europe, to understand. I mean, the government made a very important decision last week when they further prescribed further elements of the Iranian regime and their connection to the financing of Hamas. All of these are important steps, but we should be quite clear that the Iran is only gaining from this conflict, and we hope that they do not make any other significant advancements whilst our attention is elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Okay, next question from the chat. Could you explain more about the humanitarian aid situation, particularly water, medical aid, and prevention of epidemics? The way the story presented through the UK media lens and the UN doesn't reflect well on Israel, and particularly of interest is what happened with that early in the conflict. There was a decision that seemed to be rescinded fairly quickly about cutting water and food. Can you tell? So just stuff generally overview of the humanitarian side.
Sure. I mean, I'll start at the last part of the question. But right at the beginning, just for 2 or 3 days, Israel cut off everything, and kind of tested the water whether that was a viable policy, which clearly it wasn't. And then after 2 or 3 days, they recognised that despite the total war against Hamas, there is a civilian population there, and that Israel's own moral and ethics and international law needs to see humanitarian aid, primarily water, food, and medical supplies, reaching the Gaza Strip. So from that moment, first of all, Israel opened up the water pipes, which were damaged in the original barrage by Hamas rockets. And let's also understand the sequencing and the cause and effect. That the water was cut off because of Hamas rockets. So Israel repaired those in the south and restored water supply to the south. That was also already done within the first week of the conflict. In the last few days, they've now set up a second pipeline of water from Egypt, and that's been laid and is now functioning. So there are two separate water sources coming in, as well as any of the trucks that may augment that supply as well. Israel made a decision that under international law, they had no necessity to allow directly the transportation of aid, but they would facilitate it through the Egyptian crossing in Rafah, and they would also demand, being part of that mechanism, to make sure that nothing else nefarious was being smuggled in under the guise of humanitarian aid. It was in that context, and the fact that it was taking quite cumbersome for the UN and the Egyptians to process the amount of trucks that were necessary to go in, that under American pressure, just a few days ago, Israel reopened up the Kerem Shalom crossing. Kerem Shalom is that three-way crossing on the three-way Israel-Egyptian Gazan border. And so there are now two routes effectively in, some through Kerem Shalom, although some are saying that it's being checked in Kerem Shalom and then still diverting via Egypt to go in through Rafah as well. So that's a combined factor, and the idea is that the UN are there in charge, and they have an infrastructure, and they should be there capable to deliver and to ensure the supply across to the civilian population. In addition, Israel has allowed the UAE to set up a field hospital, and they have also allowed the Jordanians to airdrop medical and humanitarian aid in. Again, why I stress, because it's Israeli cooperation, because amongst the very heavy air traffic of Israeli Apache helicopter attack helicopters and drones and Air Force jets, they are allowing Jordanian military aircraft to fly over Israeli airspace in order to facilitate the dropping of airdrops into southern Gaza Strip. So that's also happening on a Israeli-Jordanian coordinated level. I think we should accept that. Listen, none of this is really enough. I'm not going to deny that there is horrific suffering in Gaza, and I think it's incumbent on Israel to continue that same mechanism to be able to facilitate as many trucks as possible. I mean, again, if you think about a pre-October the 7th scale, Israel was allowing in over 1,000, but sometimes 1,500 trucks on a daily basis. The agreement that Israel has reached with the US right now is to allow 200 trucks a day of aid to go in. So we're, again, for all those people that were calling Israel, Gaza under siege before October 7th, now realize kind of how genuinely kind of benign and actually quite humane the Israeli treatment was prior to October the 7th. And now we're in a humanitarian crisis disaster, then it's necessity to bring in as much as they can. And at the moment, it seems that 200 trucks a day is about the threshold in which the capacity allows. And even that, it's the Egyptians who are having trouble to deliver on that scope. But Israel supports those efforts.
Thanks. Next question: are the things that Israel's achieving, such as exposing the misuse of hospitals by Hamas, eliminating key players in Hamas, or reducing its military infrastructure, destroying rocket sites, are those do the key allies understand what Israel's managing to achieve, and does the media understand that?
A good question. I mean, I'm not quite sure how it's difficult to kind of to transpose and say how much there is kind of the cognitive understanding about what Israel is doing. I'll give it. It's funny those examples you give, because the example that Israelis give to themselves internally are a very different set of kind of, not a very different set, but kind of there are additional tactical achievements that talk about in military terms closing the cycle of fire, they call it, from the time it takes intelligence to identify a target to call in the airstrike. Sometimes has been down to 6 minutes, which is almost unheard of in modern warfare. People also might have seen they've made, as they always do in military operations, they make split-second decisions to abort attacks when there are signs that there are too many civilians in the area. And they recently released some footage saying, that they were about to attach a target. And they said, no, hold on, there's kind of a group of young boys playing football around the back of this building. Abort, abort, abort. So those things are happening. There are various different, the close level coordination, all again unprecedented, between ground forces and air forces ground forces being able to call in airstrikes. That every brigade has have drones attached to them that give them eyes in the sky, an incredible level of coordination on that level. All of these are impressive tactical achievements. I don't know how much they impress Israel's allies, but certainly from a domestic audience, it is satisfying. Especially bear in mind, part of the shock and the tragedy of October 7th was the initial military failure, both in terms of intelligence, in terms of operational, and in terms of deployment. So all of these things I've mentioned are part of a rehabilitation of the military's domestic image. And certainly that is kind of succeeding to an extent, although all of those questions about the failures on the 7th itself are still waiting for the day after. And I'm sure we're going to get into all of that in detail in the years to come.
Okay. There's a couple of questions that I'll try and group together about Hamas. So there's one about Hamas's sort of political wing, which has also always historically had a kind of social aspect to it, in terms of like providing for the civilian population. Does that distinction exist any more between a slightly softer political wing and hard military wing that actually perpetrated the atrocities on the 7th of October, or is it all one integrated organisation? And then have they succeeded so much in radicalising Palestinian civilians in Gaza through their control of the education system that you've got a highly radicalised population there, even after Hamas has lost its military control?
Okay, so on the first question, I think you have to look at it as kind of that they work in cheek and jowl together, the military and the social. There's not, since post October 7th and since kind of Hamas as well has been thrust into this war, it's very difficult to assess their social capability. Whilst the premise of the question is true in a pre-October 7th world, I don't think it's so relevant right now, because they're also in total war, and so there is they have no ability to deliver on any social domestic kind of non-military capacity whatsoever. That's yesterday's news. Again, it remains to be seen whether they will return to that role, or whether Israel will succeed in destroying them and having them replaced. So that's also a question for the next day. In terms of the radicalization and kind of where the Palestinian Gaza population is, again, we don't know yet. It's too early to say, because it's, first of all, the question is right, that the level of incitement, the level of indoctrination, the level of kind of a totalitarian fear society where people were always skeptical about any polling done in Gaza, because people live under a dictatorial regime which is brutal against its political enemies. How much and how quickly, that will be another sign. Just as I said at the beginning, that one of the key things to look out for, the key indicators, is about the Hamas fighters surrendering, because they understand that the military makeup of their units has been destroyed. So similarly, when we start to see more Hamas Gazan civilians talking out against Hamas and blaming them, hopefully we will see that more and more. That will be a very important and significant signal that Hamas's power is waning, or is even being removed. But it's also human nature that when you're attacked by an external enemy, one kind of, even if you didn't like Hamas, it's reasonable to suggest that more people will be kind of backing their own because Israel is the one carrying out the bombing. And although we understand that this is all this disaster is brought upon by Hamas, and Hamas is clearly to blame, I accept that there is a competing narrative, if you're a Palestinian, that will be maybe far more accommodating to what Hamas is trying to do. So again, I'm sorry for hedging, but it's not yet clear how the Palestinian population will respond on the day after.
Thanks. And now, an interesting question. Turkey is obviously a major regional power in the Middle East. Is it playing any role behind the scenes in this conflict or trying to resolve this conflict?
Well, again, in a pre-October 7th world, when we looked about where Hamas's best allies were, we would point both to Qatar and Turkey as the two closest regimes that kind of were the closest to Muslim Brotherhood type Sunni jihadi power sources. Now, obviously, the Qataris are playing a very prominent role right now. The Turks significantly less so. Behind the scenes, they're making belligerent noises. They're no friends of Israel. They're threatening Israel. When the Prime Minister made a comment about, like I mentioned before, about the idea that to target Hamas leadership all over the world, and made particular reference to Qatar, Lebanon, and Turkey, because that's where some of the Hamas leadership remain. The Turks obviously then took the opportunity to respond back in a kind of bellicose manner of don't you dare. But the truth is that right now, as far as I'm aware, in terms of the heavy political lifting, they've kind of been cut out of this equation. Qataris on their side are quite happy to have the limelight to themselves and not looking to share it. If you remember, by the way, there was a scenario back in 2014 where President Obama tried to empower the Qataris and the Turks together in order to open up a second track of communication. And that time, that was a complete failure because Israel had invested in the Egyptian track. And so the Turkish Qatari one was a distraction that made the fighting last prolonged even further. Right now, the Qataris are really the only game in town in terms of the voice towards Egypt, the voice towards Hamas. Egypt play a secondary role, but Turkey, as far as I'm aware, are not really in the picture right now.
Mm-hmm. Next question. Have you got any further information on the arrests of Hamas operatives in Germany and the Netherlands who were allegedly planning terrorist attacks in Europe?
No, I'm sorry. You've got me on that one. I don't have anything. I don't have anything. I mean, my focus is very much on the region with a preference to the UK. So I defer to others on the other European issues. Sorry.
Yeah. Next question. Is the War Cabinet are dealing with all the security situation? Is there really a functioning Israeli government dealing with the domestic, keeping the rest of the national infrastructure and stuff ticking over? How does that work? Do the rest of the cabinet still meet separately to talk about internal matters?
We've got a proliferation here where there are 4 different cabinets. There is the inner war cabinet, which are the 3 main decision makers plus the 2 advisors, Eisenkot and Dermer. That's the war cabinet. The Prime Minister, the Defence Minister, and Gantz are the 3 decision makers, added with those 2 others that are there in an observer or a consultancy capacity. Then you have the standard security cabinet, which by law was the one that was convened to decide any hostage situation. You've then got the socio-economic cabinet, and I think this is one that is still functioning. Although again, in the current climate, it was the socio-economic cabinet that dealt with the issue last week, which is a very complicated, difficult issue about do you allow Palestinian workers with work permits from the West Bank to work into Israel? Now, on one level, the military were arguing, yes, you should, because they've been vetted by security, and it's seen as a very important lever for the success and the stability of the West Bank to make sure that their economy doesn't crash either. And so it's a very important economic lever to allow these people to come in and gain gainful employment, and it also helps the Israeli economy. Against them, with the vast majority of the socio-economic cabinet that were up in arms and said, this is, you're failing again to that same misconception of pre-October October the 7th. How can you think that in the current climate we would allow any Palestinian workers to come into Israel? And so the compromise is reached on a smaller number. Again, I'll remind people that prior to October the 7th, there were over 120,000 Palestinian West Bankers that had permits inside Israel. Right now, they've let in 8,000, which is obviously a tiny proportion. And the debate was deferred to another time to see if they would allow any more in. But that's kind of, so I mean, broadly speaking, I mean, aside from the security issues, yes, the government is functioning as well. It was functioning. I mean, people outside of the government or the opposition would certainly criticize that there are still numerous irrelevant ministries that are sucking the resources from the country and that have no right to exist at all, in terms of Minister for Heritage, Minister for Religious Affairs, even the kind of Minister for the Periphery, Minister for Intelligence. There are probably half a dozen of these made-up ministries that were created for political expediency to allow the coalition to function, which many people are pointing to and saying, time to get rid of these. But broadly speaking, in terms of the kind of economic functioning, the country is still operating.
I think we'll carry on for about another 15 minutes. Is that okay with you, Richard?
Sure.
If Israel wins the war, what sense do we have of Israel's preferred or likely post-war plan for how Gaza is governed?
So in stage 3, which will start in about a month or so, Israel will withdraw the majority of their ground troops. They will form a buffer zone that will give kind of that reassurance to the home front, and then they will operate in targeted manner, either by airstrikes or by elite forces, pinpointed operations to continue to target Hamas and to target any of the threats. And that time, it's hoped that there will be this is a gradual process, but led by the Americans and the Saudis are considered the two key international partners. American because they have a vested interest in it and they show general leadership. The Saudis because they also have pretensions for regional leadership and they have the money. But a combination led by the US and Saudis that will include the other Gulf states, Egypt and Jordan. Other countries have been mentioned as well, the EU, India, would come in with various resources, both in terms of financial capacity, both in terms of practical rehabilitation of the strip and the rebuilding. That's the third stage, which again, all bets are off, but it could last up to a year or so. And then there's the transition to the fourth stage, where there needs to be a transfer of power over into some other entity. Now, the Prime Minister Netanyahu has been quite clear that it won't be the Palestinian Authority. I think that's again, I think he's playing politics to a large degree, because as far as all those allies that I mentioned, the US, the Saudis in particular, they are talking that their only game in town is a Palestinian Authority, but the new language they're using is a revitalized Palestinian Authority. What does that mean? No one quite knows, but from the Israeli perspective, it's hoped that it means that it's an authority that is missing the elements of incitement, missing the idea of the toxic pay to slay, whereby you give the money to the terrorists proportionate to how many Jews they've killed, and you cut out the corruption, etc. as well. One of them, there are various different names because a lot of this is kind of, it needs a figurehead, it needs kind of an emblem that will be the address. Some of the interesting names mentioned. I think Majid Fares is probably the most interesting. Again, all of these names, that would be Israel's dream, but the last thing that Israel will say is publicly to endorse them, because that's the kiss of no Palestinian leader worth his salt wants an endorsement from the Israeli side. But Majid Fares is the head of internal security in the West Bank. He's probably the third most powerful person in the West Bank, behind Abu Mazen and Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh. And if he was to transfer over and to become kind of the leader or the kind of the governor, called give the title whatever you want, of the Gaza Strip, that would be someone that has the faith of Israel, privately. They won't say it publicly, but has the support of all of those coalition partners and could become a real option. Another idea, which the Palestinian Authority like less, because again, Fares is of the Palestinian Authority very much so, is Mohammed Dahlan. Dahlan is also a former Fatah guy. He used to be the head internal security guy in Gaza, but was since fell out with Abu Mazen, and for the last 15 years has been exiled elsewhere in the Arab world. Significantly, he is very close to the leader in the Emirates, bin Zayed. He's served as an advisor to him, and he also has very close relations with al-Sisi in Egypt. So he is of Gaza, but he's kind of an outsider insider that could also be an acceptable figurehead for the international community and for the Palestinians. I think all of that boils down to, I mean, both, by the way, I say both of those names are highly speculative. Who knows how this will play out? And there are lots of, so I don't want to kind of suggest that this is all a done deal. But as you frame the question in terms of best case scenario, I suppose one of those two, and the other name that is again in the Israel's dream scenario would be someone like Salam Fayyad, who again was the former prime minister from 20 years ago, is seen as a technocrat, a doer, non-corrupt, credible. There's another guy who I'm forgetting his name, who also comes from a technocratic background, a Palestinian economist. I'm blanking on his name, sorry. But again, there are other names in the mix that could be kind of a technocratic type, non-politicized leader that can work in cooperation with the international community and deliver something practically for the people of Gaza.
Right. I'm going to jump ahead because I want to make sure we get this question because it's kind of interesting for a UK audience. How does Israel view the appointment of the comeback of David Cameron as Foreign Secretary?
I mean, listen, officially Israeli government won't comment on appointments of another democratic government. David Cameron has good, close relationships with Prime Minister Netanyahu. They know each other. They know each other many years. He knows other Israeli senior politicians. He's a known entity here. He's broadly seen as a safe pair of hands, and I think people won't say anything bad about him. But essentially, it's a UK decision. What I thought you were going to ask me, and I'll answer it if you already don't want me to answer it, is about Tony Blair's return to the region.
Oh, I hadn't spotted that.
So there is speculation that he's got a meeting coming up soon with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and just as I spoke about kind of from that stage 3, if they're looking for an international non-Palestinian project manager, then that's in the context that Tony Blair's name is being mentioned as well. So it's kind of, I think British politics is getting like Israeli politics of recycling the leaders, and never say never in return. But someone like Blair has a very high level of credibility on the Israeli side. His role when he served as the head of the quartet was very much appreciated. And I think it's also worth remembering that when he was head of the quartet, it was Blair that set the international community's criteria for what it would take to accept Hamas into the family of nations and into mainstream international diplomacy. Those 3 conditions were recognize the state of Israel, condemn and put the guns down, condemn terrorism, and recognize previous signed agreements between Israel and the PLO, i.e. Oslo, which they've never done. And I think, by the way, that was 20 years ago. And those same 3 tests, I think, are a very reasonable standard in which to hold Hamas to still. And unfortunately, spoiler alert, I don't think we're going to get them anywhere near there.
Okay. Next question. How can we trust Qatar, who seem to be trying to put themselves up as a negotiator, interlocutor, when they are actually the long-term funders of Hamas?
Absolutely correct. You can't trust them. I mean, I'm going to kind of hold back my non-diplomatic language. Israel needs Qatar right now because of the hostage situation, but because of their relationship and the hosting of the Hamas external leadership, they have some form of traction over Hamas. And therefore, it's kind of realpolitik necessary right now to do a deal with Qatar. But as the question was inferring, Qatar are a force for evil, maybe stretching it, but they are not a constructive player in this. They have a horribly duplicitous game. That the role that Al Jazeera Arabic plays, forget about the English one, which is a little bit more palatable. But from colleagues that I trust, Al Jazeera Arabic is Muslim Brotherhood, is a Hamas mouthpiece. It has done enormous strategic damage in spreading hate across the region for so long. As you say, they support Hamas. They facilitate Hamas leadership. They fund Hamas. They have a vested interest that Hamas survives the day after, and they want to be in the position to help pour in their funds to increase their influence and traction and hold over the region by investing further in Hamas. So I think beyond the hostage deal, where we kind of need them, Qatar should be isolated and disgraced. And again, there's a lot of calls for Israel on America that the US should be using their pressure to influence the Qataris far more and pressurize them to stop their duplicitous game. When I say duplicitous, I mean that they still host the US Air Force in the region at the same time as hosting Hamas. They still are kind of part of that the accepted norms within the debate over the release of the hostages. But as I said before, they have a vested interest to support Hamas, and they've cleansed themselves over hosting of the World Cup and buying up all this property in London and funding the universities in the States. All of this is a very dangerous and negative influence on the discourse.
Mm-hmm. We've got a question here about the international bodies. What's the role that the UN could play? The UN, is there actually a way of the UN making a ceasefire happen? Would be my question when they have these repeated votes at different levels about it. And what's the role that the ICC could play?
Well, so listen, the UN, you have to break it down because there are various different UN bodies. If we're talking about kind of the overall kind of the political bodies, whether it be the General Assembly or the Security Council, can they be a force? I mean, listen, Israel is, as I'm sure most of the people, everyone on this call knows, has a very negative, benign view of the role that the UN has played. The automatic blocking majority for autocratic, supportive of Israel's enemies. There's a long running experience of Israel's disdain and even disgust for the UN as an institution. So I don't think Israel holds out much hope. Again, practically on the ground, whether it comes to UNRWA or other kind of specific issues about the perpetuation of the refugee situation, and the selective work of UNICEF, you name it, every UN body has Israel has issues with it, both in the specifics and in the generality. Do we think that the UN can find is there a scenario where no, I just don't see anything, unfortunately. I'm trying to think of anything redeeming I can say for the UN, and if anyone has one, I'm happy to hear it. In terms of the ICC, again, Israel doesn't have a great record there. But again, there is a sense that there is a misunderstanding of Israel's predicament in defending itself over the causality of how this began and their willingness to call out Hamas. If I was to give an optimistic spin on things, maybe that there is a case if Israel were to arrest any really senior Hamas officials and kind of bring them for trial inside Israel, or then take them to the ICC and kind of use that as a platform to expose Hamas crimes against humanity. These are the claims, but I don't hold out much hope for these international institutions. I think Israel has to do it themselves.
Okay. I think we'll just do one final question because I can see that the number of participants dropping a little bit as people are going off to have dinner, etc. So is it correct that half the IAF's bombs are unguided? So how could those be aimed at specific targets, and doesn't that lead to unnecessary deaths?
I don't know the statistics. I don't think it's half, but there are certainly an element of the munitions which are not all smart, kind of super smart guided. But even these dumb bombs, it's kind of a slight misnomer in terms of how they're characterized. But even they can be aimed and have a fair degree of precision. They can't necessarily be moved and maneuvered as you can with ballistic missiles. But they still have some degree of accuracy. And again, depending on the targets, depending on the necessity of whether you want to, in the past, Israel has sent in tiny bombs through a window to target someone in a particular bed and not hit someone else in the same room. So kind of there have been unbelievable aspects of accuracy. Obviously, with a non-precision weapons, you can't do that. But still, if you're aiming for a building with a non-smart bomb, you can still make sure with Israel's technology that you can still hit it. So there's no essence that they're just kind of, this is not Russia who uses kind of statistical weapons to just flood an area and hit and hope. That's not the Israeli way. Every bomb has a specific target and a focus to it. And again, to remind the audience that every bomb every bomb that is dropped has a legal advisor looking over it to understand and ascertain the legality of every single strike. So I feel relatively comfortable. I mean, again, there's no getting around it that that A, mistakes happen, and B, collateral damage is factored into some of these things, and that's a horrible phrase when we're talking about the loss of innocent life, and I will want to recognise that. But I don't think there's any truth to the idea of indiscriminate fire or a kind of deliberately inaccurate bombs.